And here is Mr. Bernstein.
Hello again to everybody. I'm awfully glad to see you all back again. And I want to thank you all particularly for your wonderful letters and telegrams about our last show, which made us all feel very happy and proud. Now this time we're going to be talking about what makes American music sound American. And just to start things off, here's a little American music. Now, I don't think there's anybody in this hall or anywhere in the country watching this program, or for that matter, anyone anywhere in the civilized world who wouldn't know right away that that music we just played is American music. It's got America written all over it, not just in the title, which, as you know, is An American in Paris, and not just because the composer Gershwin was American, but it's in the music itself. It sounds American. It smells American. It makes you feel American when you hear it. Now, why is that? What makes certain music seem to belong to America and seem to belong to us? Now, that's what we're going to try and find out today. Almost every country or nation has some kind of music that belongs to it and sounds right and natural for its people. When a nation has its own kind of music, we call that music nationalistic. Sometimes it's just folk music, very simple songs, or sometimes not even songs, maybe just prayers for rain banged out on Congo drums, or sort of primitive chanting in an Arab style. Go, Wah-la! Or it could be dance music, like a mazurka from Poland. Or it could be a tarantella from Italy. This is a piece I learned when I was 11. I still can't play it very well. There. Or it might be a reel from Ireland. But the minute you hear that reel, you know it's Irish. Just the way you knew that mazurka was Polish or the tarantella was Italian. Now, you tell me what country this music makes you think of. What country is that? Right. My goodness, you're, as you would say, hep. Now, it's Spanish. You couldn't mistake that rhythm in a million years. Or you couldn't mistake those castanets. Or the tambourines. That's Spanish. Now, what country does this music make you think of? Right again. Some of you said gypsy, some said Hungary. It's the same idea. It's Hungarian as goulash. Can't mistake that. Now, what about this? Right. My, you're all so smart today. That's Russian. You can't miss it. It's got to be Russian because it has a Russian folk song in it. It has a tune that all Russians know, and it's sung since they were little kids. That tune, by the way, is called the Little Birch Tree. And in Russian, I don't sing Russian very well, but it goes something like this. I think that's the word. Soyala, loli, loli, soyala, loli, loli, soyala. Well, Tchaikovsky used that tune in that symphony we just played, and that settles that symphony. It's Russian. So you can understand that when this kind of music is played in the country it belongs to, all the people listening to it feel that it belongs to them, that they belong to it. It's their music. Because in most countries, the people who live there are descended for hundreds and hundreds of years from their forefathers and their forefathers' forefathers, who all sang the same little tunes and sort of owned them. So when the Russians hear a Tchaikovsky symphony, they feel closer to it than, say, a Frenchman does, or than we do. Now, what about us here in America? What's our folk music? What did our forefathers sing? That's the problem, because we all have different kinds of forefathers. For example, Mr. Corigliano there has Italian forefathers, and Varga's forefathers were, what were they, Hungarian, and mine were Jewish, and Mr. McGuinness's were Scotch-Irish, and Mr. Wummer's were Dutch, I believe, Dutch. And what about your forefathers? What about yours? What were your forefathers? Can you tell? What about yours? Hungarian, somebody just said. What were yours? Polish. What were yours? Well, you see, we could be here all day listing all the forefathers that you had. We could be here for ages. Sweden, Spain, Hungary, England, Germany. They come from everywhere. But we haven't got ours to be here and list them all. So you see, that is our problem. The problem is that with all those different forefathers we have, what is it that we all have in common that we could call our folk music? The folk music we've inherited. Now that's a tough question, because you see, we haven't had a very long time to develop a folk music. Don't forget, America's a very new country compared to all those European ones. We're not even 200 years old yet, and that's not very old for countries. We're still a baby, a big, strong, fine baby, but still a baby. And so our music is also still very young. Actually, our real serious American music didn't even begin till about 75 years ago. And at that time, the few American composers we did have were imitating the European composers, like Brahms and Liszt and Wagner and all those. We might call that the kindergarten period of American music. Our composers then were like happy, innocent little kids in kindergarten. For instance, we had a very fine composer named George W. Chadwick. And he wrote very expert music and also deeply felt music. But you can almost not tell it apart from the music of Brahms and Wagner and other Europeans, like this overture of his. Listen. European stuff. But around the beginning of our 20th century, American composers were beginning to feel funny about not writing American-sounding music. And it took a foreigner to point this out to them. A Czechoslovakian composer named Dvorak, who came here on a visit and was amazed to find all the American composers writing the same kind of music he wrote. So he said to the American composers, look, why don't you use your folk stuff in your own music when you write? You've got marvelous stuff here. Indian music, which is the Indians are the real Native Americans, he said. After all, they were here before you were, so use their music. But he was forgetting the important thing, that Indian music has nothing to do with most of us. Our forefathers were not Indians. And so their music is not our music. We didn't grow up ourselves banging on primitive drums and yelling war whoops. But Dvorak didn't worry about all that. He got excited, so excited, that he decided he was going to write an American symphony himself and show us all how it could be done. So he made up some Indian themes and some Negro themes, because he also decided Negro folk music was part of American history, and he wrote a whole new world symphony around those themes. The trouble is that the symphony doesn't sound very American. It sounds Czech, really, which is what it should sound, and very pretty it is too. Listen. Doesn't sound American to me. Now, I'm sure you all know the second movement of this symphony. It's the most famous part of the symphony. It's a tune that everybody knows, usually by the name of Goin' Home. Most people think it's a Negro spiritual, and it's often sung that way. But it isn't a Negro spiritual at all. A nice Czech melody by Uncle Dvorak. And there's nothing Negro or American about it. In fact, if I put words to it about Czechoslovakia, it could easily sound like the Czech national anthem. Supposing I sang, Czechoslovakia, how I long for thee. It's perfectly Czech. There's nothing American about it at all. But in spite of this, Dvorak made a big impression on the American composers of his time, and they all got excited too, and began to write hundreds of so-called American pieces with Indian and Negro melodies in them. It became a disease, almost an epidemic. Everybody was doing it. And most of these Montezuma operas and Minnehaha symphonies and cotton-picking suites are all dead and forgotten and gathering dust in second-hand bookstores. Why? Because you can't just decide to be American. You can't just sit down and say, I'm going to write American music if it kills me. You can't be nationalistic on purpose. That was the mistake. But it was a natural mistake for our composers to be making at the beginning. Those early men were just learning to be American. They were just graduating from that kindergarten we talked about into grammar school. But even out of this grammar school period came some pretty fine music. A lot of it by Edward MacDowell. MacDowell wrote a suite, among other things, that uses Indian folk stuff in it, and I still can't say it sounds very American to me. He thought it sounded American, but it's more, to me, like our old friend Dvorak again. Just listen. New World Symphony, isn't it? Then there was a composer called Henry F. Gilbert, who was also very talented, but who was more interested in Negro themes than Indian ones. Here's part of a piece he wrote using tunes and rhythms of Negroes in New Orleans, especially a Creole dance called the bambula. Now, as you can see, McDowell and Gilbert and all those people wrote very fine music indeed, but it's hard for us Americans to feel that it's our music, the way a Russian feels about a Tchaikovsky symphony. In fact, those Indian and Negro themes even sound a little strange and exotic to us, if we tell the truth. So we still didn't have a real American music, not yet. But now our American composers were about to graduate from grammar school and enter high school. By this time, the First World War was already over, and something new and very special had come into American music. Can you guess what it is? What was it? Right, jazz had been born, and that changed everything, because at last there was something like an American folk music that belonged to all Americans. Jazz was everybody's music. Everybody could dance the foxtrot back in the 20s. Everybody knew how to sing Alexander's Ragtime Band, whether he came from North Dakota or West Virginia or South Carolina. So any serious composer growing up in this time couldn't keep jazz out of his ears or out of his music. It was part of him. It was in the air he breathed. A composer like Aaron Copeland began to write pieces such as music for the theater, which is filled with jazz ideas, like this. that, being played by the Boston Symphony Orchestra 30-odd years ago, as it was, what a shock those Bostonians must have had hearing Copeland's jazz in Symphony Hall.